that with their pictures, if we can do it. Do we have it? Okay, we have them coming along. Just to let you know about Mike Anderson, there's the gentleman. Married from the Spokane area, Spokane, Washington. He likes photography, chess, tennis. This is somebody who was always fascinated by science fiction, and much like when I was a kid, he was enthralled with Lost in Space, Star Trek, and he's a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. This was his second space flight. Obviously, he did something, as the president said, high and noble in his life. We move on to the mission specialist, David Brown, 46 years old, a captain in the U.S. Navy, an aviator, a flight surgeon. Yes, this gentleman went to medical school, from Eastern Virginia Medical School. In college, he was a competitive gymnast. He performed in a circus, in fact. He was an acrobat. He walked on stilts. He walked on a 7-foot unicycle. All these people are well-rounded, well-educated, well-accomplished. I mean, these are human beings that we had a chance to talk to a couple weeks ago. We move on to Kalpana Chawla, who wasn't born in the United States. She was a great example of the fact that this is an international effort. She was born in India, 41 years old. She was a flight instructor for airplanes and gliders. She enjoyed flying aerobatics, so she got a lot of excitement in her life, and I'm sure it was a thrill, as she expressed it when we talked to her a couple of weeks ago, a thrill to be in the space shuttle is something she never thought would ever happen, but as she got older, of course, dreamed of. Another mission specialist, Laurel Clark. Laurel Clark, 41 years old, married, had a child, a commander in U.S. Navy, and again, a naval flight surgeon. And she liked scuba diving. She was a hiker, parachuting, flying, traveling. She talked to her brother yesterday by email. She sent him an email, and he reflected this. He's talking about this today, talking about how much she was enjoying her experience aboard the shuttle, and that he's glad that she got a chance to go up into space. And he said that it had been a dream of hers for her entire life. And then finally, number 7 in these, payload specialist Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. This gentleman, a son of a Holocaust survivor, married, 4 children, liked snow skiing, played squash, and I had a chance to talk to him among the 4 that we talked to 2 weeks ago. Let's see a bit of a clip from that. You were the first Israeli on a mission like this, first astronaut with us. Did you take anything into the trip with you that is special to commemorate this?
Of course, I took several special things. First of all, the Israeli flag, the Israeli Declaration of Independence, and I took some commemorate things from the Holocaust. And I took also a very special glass for the Kiddush, for the Shabbat.
Ilan Ramon, among the 7 astronauts apparently lost today. The Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon's office, issued a statement. The state of Israel and its citizens are as one at this difficult time. And I do recall a couple weeks ago, as I tossed back to you, Greg and Derry, I remember very distinctly telling these folks to be careful and to get home safely. It's something none of us should take for granted. I'm sure we never will.
You know, Bob, I just wanted to comment on that because, as you said, I was sitting next to you when that interview happened, and you know, it was just incredible how excited they were. They were like kids in a candy store. I mean, some of the most brilliant people on Earth up there in space, and they were so excited. And I remember how they were sitting so close together. And if you remember, Ilan Ramon showed us something. It was some sort of a religious symbol in silver that he had taken with us, and with him. And I remember he was talking about that, and it just strikes me how incredibly excited they are, and as the president said, this space travel has become almost so routine that we forget the dangers of such a mission. And yet NASA, of course, the NASA family, grieving, they are very well aware of how dangerous, how far they've come, but still how dangerous this is. But
absolutely.
I have to say, I still remember those faces of them just giggling, talking about the dynamics of living in space together in such close headquarters and how important it was to each of them, you know, for their own individual reasons.
Yeah, I agree with you. They did seem very excited. And, you know, I got to tell you, it was exciting for me. I had never talked to any shuttle astronauts when they were in space, and it was really an exciting moment. And obviously, Mr. Ramon was extremely proud to be the first Israeli, and all of them were proud. I mean, Kalpana Chawla was talking about being from India originally, and how excited she was to be there. I agree with you. They were all very excited to be up there, and our hearts go out to all the families that have to endure another tragedy.
As the president said, these men and women assume great risk in the service to all humanity. They knew the dangers and faced them willingly. Bob Sellers, thank you for telling us about them. We appreciate it.
And the president just speaking about 25 minutes ago, sharing with the nation his sudden shock and grief, but of course pledging that journeys into space will continue. Let's listen to some of what else he had to say.
The cause in which they died will continue. Mankind is led into the darkness beyond our world by the inspiration of discovery and the longing to understand. Our journey into space will go on. In the skies today, we saw destruction and tragedy. Yet farther than we can see, there's comfort and hope.
Let's turn now to Catherine Herridge, our Homeland Security correspondent who's standing by in Washington. And Catherine, a couple of points that were made very, very quickly by White House officials today. And one of them is that the altitude of Columbia at the time that it disintegrated or exploded way too high for a surface-to-air missile, correct?
Yeah, that's right. The Homeland Security Department officials I spoke to indicated that given the altitude, given the speed of the shuttle, it seemed highly unlikely that terrorism had a role in this disaster. They also indicated to me just a short time ago that there had been no intelligence, no threat information suggesting that the shuttle had been a target. Now, in addition to this, they're also telling me that Secretary Ridge does have a very important role in this situation. He was notified by NASA just after 9:18 this morning. He then went immediately to the White House to implement his role as the coordinator for domestic incidents. Now, that involved convening a conference call with the relevant parties, in this case NASA, as well as Northcom. This is the newly created body under the control of the DoD, the Department of Defense, as well as FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA is one of the 22 federal agencies which will fold into the Department of Home officially on March 1st. Secretary Ridge then contacted either the governors or the Homeland Security coordinators in the affected states, and I'm told that included Arizona, New Mexico, as well as Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. He briefed them on the situation, and he also talked to them about securing the debris fields. Obviously, a very important part of the investigation now to determine what went wrong on the shuttle. Now, officials tell me that under an executive order that was signed by the president last week, that Secretary Ridge is the designated coordinator for domestic incidents, regardless of whether terrorism is involved. As you will recall, FEMA does come under the control of the Department of Homeland Security, and it is the lead agency for response in situations such as this. Of course, this is the first time Secretary Ridge has implemented this rule since he was sworn in as the first Secretary for Homeland Security just over about a week and a half ago. The important point, though, for everyone to emphasize is that the officials I've talked to said there was no threat information, no intelligence information indicating that the shuttle was a target for terrorists. And at this point, as you mentioned, the height, the speed at which the shuttle was traveling would also make that seem very unlikely. Back to you.
Catherine, we heard obviously from NASA's administrator there will be internal as well as external investigations, and certainly well beyond other agencies will get involved here. In the Director of Homeland Security's capacity as the quote-unquote coordinator, what does that mean? Does that mean he supervises? Does he direct? Does he oversee? It is such a new department, and he is the very first director. I'm trying to get a handle on just how he coordinates.
Well, this is the first time that this has ever been implemented, so there may be somewhat of a learning curve as we all come to understand what role he will play. But under that executive order, he is the designated point person. If we kind of go back, let's say, a year or 2 years ago in a situation like this, you would most likely have the head of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as sort of the point person or coordinator. But with the creation of the new department, FEMA is just one of the 22 agencies that now come under his control. What I can ascertain based on the conversations I've had today is that the Homeland Security Department was involved very early. We know Secretary Ridge was notified at 9:18. I am also led to believe that their coordination center, which is in Northwest Washington, was involved monitoring the situation. That coordination center has been in place now for about 6 months. I've been there. They sort of have connectivity, as they like to say here in Washington, with all of the different federal agencies as well as some state and local agencies. They can look at information as it's coming in and then make some decisions on how they need to proceed. I think it's very interesting that that conference call the Secretary convened this morning brought together obviously NASA and then NORTHCOM, which is this newly created body by the Department of Defense, which is sort of the sort of security arm for the North American continent, and then FEMA. And then after that, Secretary Ridge reached out to the states involved and briefed them. As I mentioned earlier, that was Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. And critically important, talking about how to secure these debris fields. So he seems to be sort of the conduit, the point person between these federal agencies, and then also reaching out to the states, which is a very, very important part of his role in that office.
Well, a lot of people wondered on Capitol Hill especially whether this would work. I guess we're going to find out now under the direction of the new Homeland Security Director. And joining us has been Catherine Herridge, our Homeland Security correspondent. Catherine, thanks.
All right, now let's, I want to get a little bit more detail about the space shuttle. On the phone with us is Alan Ladwig. He is a former NASA administrator. And Alan, I have a question for you. I'm reading that when the shuttle returns to Earth, it returns as an unpowered glider. It uses small maneuvering jets to change its orientation until it gets deep enough into the atmosphere. So therefore, it has no fly-around capability, and it has to reach its intended runway. What's the emergency contingency plan if this does not go right, as it did not today?
There really isn't much they can do. They've got a one-time opportunity to land. If they miss the runway for any reason, they're going to crash down into the land or further down into the river. So they have to get it right the first time, and after 112 missions, we've never seen anything like this. So this is why it's even more tragic to have something like this happen during a landing.
What is the significance of the fact that, yes, in 42 years of U.S. spaceflight, we have never seen a problem like this on descent?
You know, I think what it means is we've had a very safe system up until this point. Certainly.
But does that mean that it is easier to land than it is to take off?
Well, you certainly have less dynamic activities going on. During a landing, you've got all these millions and millions of pounds of very high velocity fuels and things, and to cause the explosion. It used to be when we would see the shuttle clear the launch pad, we thought everything was fine and the shuttle was on its way. Then with the Challenger accident, you saw the problems with the external tanks, or the solid rocket boosters. And then it got to be, well, nobody felt relieved until after the rocket boosters popped off and you saw them fall down. Then I think we all felt, okay, once it's up in orbit, it's come down, there won't be any problems. Now I dare say in the future, we'll all be holding our breath again as the shuttle comes into a re-entry mode, and we won't feel good until it lands.
All right, Alan Ladwig, a former NASA administrator, we certainly appreciate that input.
Joining us now is the Reverend Garrett Booth, pastor at the Grace Community Church in Houston, Texas. Both Commander Rick Husband, who lost his life earlier today, as well as his colleague, Payload Commander Michael Anderson, also on board the Space Shuttle Columbia. Pastor Booth, thank you for taking a few minutes to speak with us. Your thoughts at this terrible tragedy?
Well, obviously, our hearts and prayers go out to Evelyn and Sandy and their children at this time. For sure, we're standing with them.
Have you had the opportunity to speak to family members of either Rick Husband or Michael Anderson?
Well, I've been in touch with a couple of folks at NASA, but I can't really comment any further on that.
What do you say to members of your congregation, because they're going to be grieving too? They've lost one of their own. They've lost two of their own. Right.
Well, obviously, Rick and Mike were just really a part of the life of our church, and we've lost two family members today. And just the repercussions of that and the outpouring of concern from not just church members, but the community and certainly the nation is really pretty overwhelming. We choose to believe that their faith, their deep faith in Jesus Christ, is seen them through and will be strength and comfort for the families that are left behind.
Talk to us about Rick Husband, Michael Anderson. Who were they? What were they like?
Well, we had a send-off for both of them on a Sunday morning early in January before they left for Florida. And just the most striking thing about both of them was their sense of duty and patriotism, their excitement about this mission. They both talked about how excited they were to be with Mr. Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, and just the significance that that would hold. Both men were just men of integrity, great fathers and family men, and they both had a real deep faith in Jesus Christ that went beyond their successes and their work. It's really the foundation for their lives, and they'll be deeply missed.
Times like these often test people's faith in God. Will you address that in your remarks to the congregation, to the family, when they pose the question, why, how?
Right. Well, obviously there are all kinds of questions being asked in this moment, and some of them we'll have answers for, and others we may not have an answer for this side of eternity. But we just trust that the Lord, He does have those answers, and we'll be helping folks wrestle with those questions tomorrow. We'll be having 3 services, 9, 10, and 11 o'clock, where we'll be addressing some of those things.
Reverend Garrett Booth, thank you very much. Our condolences to members of your congregation, two of whom you've lost today. Thank you very much for being with us.
Sure.
And we want to remind you, in about 12 minutes, NASA will come back and speak to us again with a press conference at 3 p.m. Eastern. We expect this press conference to be a bit different than the one at 1 p.m. Eastern. They say it will offer more technical information as into what went wrong today, and also the press will have an opportunity to ask their questions. Obviously, a lot on everybody's mind as to what could have happened. But first, I want to go to Jerusalem and Raanan Geeson, who is a top advisor to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. And Raanan, I have to say that this is what first started out as a victorious week for the Prime Minister and then ends up in tragedy. What is he feeling right now?
Well, you know, in our life there's ups and downs, and although a day of national mourning has not been declared, you can sense the personal as well as the national tragedy felt in Israel, felt for the astronauts, felt for the Ramon family, also felt in the United States. But it's not just a personal or national tragedy to the American people and to the Israelis. It's a very sad day for humanity. And I think you could sense it both by the conversation that the President of the United States had with Prime Minister Sharon, as well as by the reaction of the man in the street in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv. And, you know, the President came out and said that, you know, he knows that on this space shuttle there was one brave Israeli citizen. who was there to join in an effort, to develop science. And he offered his personal condolences, as well as the condolences of the American people to the Ramon family. And the Prime Minister, answered and told him that, in such difficult moments, when we are offering our sincere condolences to the families of the astronauts, on such difficult moment, the hearts of the American people and the Israeli people are bonded together. Not only do we share values, but we share perhaps a common destiny. And I think that was very reflective of the mood that the Prime Minister was in. He said, at this moment, we hold hands together and we pray together.
Mr. Ramon, obviously the first Israeli in space, had to mean so much to your country. Tell us, he was a hero. How great of a loss is this?
Yes. Well, it's not just to the country. I think what was reflective in the endeavor of these Magnificent Seven is perhaps an encapsulation of all the hopes of mankind, of people who live here, in the Middle East and elsewhere, through bloodshed, through terror, and now we have a pending war. This was seeking out to go to space, and that we all have for a future here on Earth. And indeed, what they were engaged in is trying to create a better future. Ramon is a symbol of what Israel is, not just fighting on the battlefield, but offering humanity and mankind a better future. And I think because of that, there will be more space exploration and there'll be more Israeli astronauts going out to space.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you about plans. I mean, obviously, everyone is going to take a moment and reflect on this and stand strong, but plans to put another Israeli in space, any time frame on that?
Well, we are a determined people. We never give up. One of the reasons that we're still here after 54 years is because we never gave up. We are going to struggle for our survival, but we're also going to struggle for a better future for us and for our neighbors. And that can only come through the advance of science and technology, through more space exploration. We truly believe in that vision, and therefore, while Ramon has died on the altar of science and our future development, his bequest is for us to continue in his footsteps, and I'm sure that all of the people of Israel share in this vision and this determination, and the Prime Minister will definitely continue to follow in those footsteps.
And as you say, both of our nations stand in grief today. Thank you so much, Ronen Geeson, a top advisor to Prime Minister Sharon.
The question, of course, now is what went wrong today as the Columbia shuttle re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and at roughly the speed of Mach 7, more than 12,000 miles per hour at an altitude of upwards of 200,000 feet, it seemed to break apart and disintegrate into several balls of fire. Joining us once again is Alan Ladwig, who is a former Associate Administrator for Policy at NASA. Among the possibilities here in your mind, and you have more experience than the average person by virtue of your background at NASA, what are the possibilities here? What are some of the things that the external and internal investigators will be looking at?
Well, it's awfully early to try to speculate on anything, quite frankly. Certainly, the attention that's been given to the potential problem of a missing tile at takeoff is going to be looked at. Certainly, they'll be looking at anything having to do with the retrofire engines that they fire just before they come in. And they're going to go, they have a contingency plan that they'll go down all the different systems and subsystems. They'll talk with the contractors. They'll talk with the different managers at NASA that are in charge of that. And it'll be a very comprehensive review. And the encouraging thing, I think, is that there's going to be both an internal review, and just so nobody thinks that there's anything to hide or anything to be overlooked, there's also going to be an external review. So you have to give them a chance to put these things in motion. We're only, say, less than 10 hours after the fact of all this happening. They've already jumped on these review teams. They're going to gather all that data and get to work.
Well, you mentioned two possibilities here, the missing tile upon launch that struck one of the shuttle wings, also the retrofiring of the engines. What about the angle of descent? The shuttle comes in, as I understand it, and I'm certainly no expert, at roughly 180-degree angles, so the heat tiles on the nose can absorb the bulk of the heat. If the shuttle, we are told by one expert, is off its angle even just a little bit, it can cause the shuttle to burn up. Is that one of the possibilities they'll be examining?
I really don't have enough background on the technical aspects to comment on that. I did hear former shuttle commander Rick Houck earlier today commenting on the whole reentry sequence. Much of it is done through an automated process. So again, I think as much as we'd like to have an answer today of what exactly happened, we're going to have to be patient and let the investigators do their job.
Well, and we're looking at the launch right now as it took place, I think it was about 16 days ago, and there was apparently an insulation foam part of, I think it was the rockets that struck one of the wings. I'm not sure if we could see it there in what we were just looking at a moment ago. Once in space, would the astronauts have had the opportunity to physically get out of the shuttle and do a spacewalk and examine the wing to determine whether or not, in fact, there was any material damage there?
If they had on this mission the external spacesuits that they needed to do that, I suspect they could have. I'm sorry, I don't know if they had that capability on this mission or not. And I suspect that if anybody thought that was a big enough problem, they would have done that just as a matter of safety.
What about S-turns, which allows the shuttle, once it's entered the atmosphere, to decrease speeds? These are maneuvers in which they engage. Might that have been something that the investigators will want to look at? For example, if it was too sharp of an S-turn, and that could have been a computerized turn, I'm not necessarily suggesting it was pilot error, but if the turn was excessive, that could put enormous destructive force on the shuttle?
They've got all the manuals for every system, subsystem that you can imagine, and they have detailed procedures of how to do every step. So certainly they're going to take a look at all of these things, beginning with the first firings as they're coming back into the atmosphere, and they'll take a look at everything. I can't imagine that any stone will be unturned on this. And as Bill Reedy said, he's making a personal commitment to the families and to the rest of the NASA family to find out what the problem is and get it fixed.
Modifications notwithstanding, what about the age of this particular shuttle, the oldest in the orbiter fleet?
Well, each of the shuttle orbiters were designed to fly at least 100 times. So this one was, what, 28 times, I guess it's flown. So it was certainly well within the standards that had been established for it. I doubt that the age has anything to do with it. On the other hand, I think this will serve as an excellent opportunity for the entire space community, for Congress, for the President, to take a hard look at NASA's future and to look at things like new technologies, new launch technologies, and focus on coming up with new and more modern systems that can take humans into space in the future.
I want to, we don't have this confirmed, but I want to read to you, and I'm just looking at it for the first time myself, the final radio transmission, allegedly, hang on, it just popped off, from between Columbia and Mission Control. Mission Control allegedly, and I emphasize that word, says, Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages and we did not copy your last. Columbia then says, Roger, and then the transmission breaks off after the crew member starts to say a word beginning with the sound buh, B-U-H. I can't quite make that out. Again, I want to emphasize, none of this is confirmed. Does that mean anything to you? Is that meaningful at all or not?
It doesn't mean anything to me. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean something to the people that are the experts in those systems. And again, when the review committees get up and the investigation committees get up and start doing their work, they're going to look at every piece of evidence, all the rumors, all the telemetry, all the data. Everything is going to be looked at, and I'm confident they're going to find out what the problem was.
Alan Ladwig, former Associate Administrator at NASA, you've been very kind to be with us throughout the afternoon. Our condolences to your colleagues at NASA.
And this is going to end our coverage, but we want to go to Shepard Smith, who will be taking us on from here with all of the latest, including that press conference that is scheduled to take place at 3 p.m. Shep.
And the 7 souls aboard. Right now, NASA is scheduled to hold its first official news conference on what they know so far. They will be taking questions. This from NASA, of course, held a quick briefing from Kennedy Space Center in Florida a couple of hours ago. This will be the first briefing at which reporters are allowed to answer questions or ask questions. This will be held in Houston, and we're expecting to get the feed from that any moment now. They informed us they might be running a couple of minutes behind. And it appears, at least for now, that certainly they are. We have many questions and so very few answers. This picture tells the story. The shuttle fell from 40 miles above, 204,000 feet in the air. An explosion so loud that they could feel it on the ground for tens of miles in all directions. Like an explosion on the ground, it was described. Debris is now rained across at least 2 states. Governor Mike Huckabee of Arkansas says 3 counties there have found debris from Space Shuttle Columbia and across much of Texas. Let's go to Orlando Salinas now, who's at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where this flight should have landed 15 minutes after it broke up upon re-entry. Orlando?
Shepard should have landed, as you said. Horrible day here. We have just finished following an escorted motorcade into the Kennedy Space Center. And the media all here, of course. What I've been able to put together, really, is this morning, as this tragedy started unfolding, as we know now, the family members of these 7 astronauts, some of them were here at the Kennedy Space Center, listening, watching, hearing the transmission, the conversations taking place between the Columbia and the folks at NASA, and all of a sudden they heard the words, we understand, saying, we have lost communications. And at that point, my understanding is that family members sort of looked at each other, eyes opened up awfully big. Children, we understand, were also part of this group that were there waiting to welcome their parents who have been gone now. And at that point, NASA officials realized that something was indeed wrong, horribly wrong, and ushered these family members and close friends into an anteroom very close nearby. We know that they have astronauts' quarters also very close to where this was being viewed at and listened to, and our understanding is that these folks were taken over there. Shepard, I can also tell you this much. Today, as this was taking place, we have a lot of people. When the shuttle takes off, you have hordes, thousands of people who line up, want to look at this spectacle, its beauty, and they sit here and they watch it. Well, today, sort of the same thing. You did have lots of people who were here on the periphery, all around this area, waiting to see Columbia come in. And then the word began to spread that indeed something had gone wrong, that communications had been lost. Shepard, here's something really important that we probably need to talk about again. Now, my understanding is this from NASA officials that, look, sometimes you do lose communications. Literally, when they mean communications, they mean the ability to be able to speak to the astronauts, talk as often as they possibly can. Do you lose that sometimes? Sure you do. But what really concerned them was not only did they lose those communications, they also instantly lost those electronic communications. In a split second, NASA really was out of the loop. They are able to monitor just about every single piece of equipment that is on that shuttle when it goes up, while it is up, and when it's coming down. When they realize that indeed, hey, man, we cannot speak with these people, at that split second also they realized that all those communications had been gone away. Now, instantly, again, NASA knew that. They, at that point, moved these family members away from here. Right now, as I told you, we are moving into this area. It is much more secure here right now than it has been in an awfully long time. We are indeed, as you know, waiting for this presser to take place. And as we've said, that will be taking place in Houston. And when that happens, of course, more information coming out. We are hoping that really as the day goes on, as the minutes go by, NASA here at the Kennedy Space Center will also be making more information available. But as Shepard, as we've been talking about all day, this is probably not going to be the time when we actually get any information as to what caused this. This certainly more the time for Americans to realize, and people all around the world, that we have lost something beautiful. People up there who went up to make a difference, not scared of this challenge, who certainly knew that there were risks involved. But now is the time for America and really people all around the world who follow this program, the leader all around the world, to mourn for what has happened today, Shepard.
No doubt about it. Orlando Salinas live for us at Kennedy Space Center on the Space Coast in Florida. Orlando, thanks very much. Continuing to watch these pictures now, 5 minutes past 3 o'clock in the east. It was going to be a beautiful return to Earth. Something went wrong, and to speculate about what it was 39 miles above Texas really serves no purpose at this point. NASA will have a thorough investigation. There will be oversight hearings on Capitol Hill. Spoke earlier with Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas and astronaut himself, Senator from the state of Florida, and sometimes after hours, Bill Nelson, Senator Bill Nelson, of course, of Florida, with whom we were speaking earlier. Both of them had spoken loudly and often about funding for this agency and making sure that there was enough funding to run it safely and efficiently. Those will be among the questions which will be asked, according to both senators, in the months and probably years ahead. The last time when Shuttle Challenger exploded, the shuttle program was shut down for almost 3 years. Prior to that, Apollo 1, I guess it was, shut down for 2.5 or so. These things take a great deal of time, a great deal of investigating, and the truth of the matter is the shuttle program could be down for an extended period of time. This is a picture from KDFW in Dallas, right over an interstate highway just outside of Metro Dallas, it's my understanding, one of the large pieces of the plane which plummeted to the ground. This is one of the larger plane, I say, of the shuttle which plummeted to the ground. This is one of the larger pieces, the largest of all in Nacogdoches, Texas, at the airport runway there, where a tank about 5 foot around was noticed by people at the airport at the end of a runway. And as the airport operator described it to me earlier today, they didn't know what it was, they didn't know what had happened above them, and they sent someone out there to remove it from the runway. And they hauled it off in the back of a pickup truck so that flights could resume in and out of Nacogdoches. They would later find out that, in fact, that was a piece of Shuttle Columbia. This is one of the larger debris fields, which I'm told is near that same airport in Nacogdoches, though I can't be sure of that. A great deal of tape has come in today, as you might imagine. And our helicopter pilot from the Fox station in Dallas, KDFW Fox 4 in the Metro Dallas region, pointed out earlier it's possible that for years and years, people may be finding pieces of this shuttle across the plains of Texas. Tony Snow's in Washington now. He's been monitoring developments from a presidential standpoint today. Tony?
Well, Shep, the president made a statement to the nation that was notable, again, for its plain-spokenness and also its faith. George W. Bush saying to the American people that the Columbia is lost, there are no survivors. And now, as you pointed out, there are a whole series of debates that are going to take place on Capitol Hill and around the nation, one of which is, what should the space program do? I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember when John Kennedy, 1 month before his assassination, laid out a vision of taking an American to the moon and back before the 60s were over. It took a little less than 6 years to accomplish that aim. That was a time when the space program encapsulated everything that was big, bold, and daring about the United States. Shortly thereafter, there ensued a series of battles where people said, you know what, we've done that, been there, done that. And suddenly the space program began to take a backseat to social spending and other things, and it really has never recovered the prestige. The question is whether George W. Bush once again wants to set some outlandish goal like going to Mars. His father talked about it, but he talked about it in a 35-year window, which hardly qualifies as big and bold and visionary. You have to have a truncated time schedule that forces people to do amazing things. Is he going to do that? We don't know. Similarly, there are going to be debates on Capitol Hill about the efficiency of NASA as opposed to the efficiency, I suppose, of every other government agency. Interestingly, there was a controversy actually about the upgrading of Columbia. As we pointed out many times today, today. It was the oldest in the shuttle fleet. And they spent 2 years putting in new electronics and so on. That job ran considerably over, and at one point Boeing shifted the work from Seattle to the East Coast, to the Florida area. And there are going to be some controversies, I'm sure, arising about that. So 2 levels of debate. Number one, what should the space program be and do? What place should it hold in the American imagination? And again, for people like me who are of an age who remember the first space shots and the excitement that they engendered in a lot of American hearts, there's a certain sentiment for going ahead and going bold. That's one debate. The second debate has to do with literally nuts and bolts. It has to do with dollar figures and obviously getting to the bottom of what happened. Was this a freak accident? Was this something that can be traced to bad engineering? Was there some sort of flaw? As you pointed out, we cannot at this point speculate at all with any sense of knowledge. But I guarantee you, members of Congress are going to take people in front of their committees and they're going to rake them over the coals. There will be the requisite amount of political hot dogging, as there always is. And sooner or later, we'll get to the bottom of it. Now, there are a couple of other side questions that need to be addressed. Number one, we have 3 astronauts right now in the International Space Stations, 2 Americans and a Russian. How are you going to get them down? Secondly, there are a whole series of missions that have been slated to go off on the shuttle program in months ahead. Do you give that to the European Space Agency? Do you give it to the Chinese? What is NASA going to do to deal with competitive pressure? Because there is competitive pressure. We're not the only nation now that sends rockets into space. And as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese have actually been talking openly of creating their own manned space program. So there's going to be a whole lot to talk about. Today, George W. Bush did what he should have done, which is to mourn those who died and to leave it at that. This is not a time for getting into the political ruckus. There'll be plenty of time for that. Today, we're all just dazed, stunned. For the 3rd time in our history, astronauts have died. One time they died on a launch pad, that was Apollo 1. One time on liftoff, that was the Challenger. And today, 16 minutes short of landing in front of friends and family and loved ones, 7 astronauts died, as you pointed out, 39 miles over the skies of Texas.
Tony Snow with us in Washington. Tony, thanks very much as always. I want to go to Amarillo, Texas now. Amarillo, the home to the pilot William McCool, to the commander Rick Husband, 45 years old, Air Force colonel from Amarillo. Trent Sizemore is the mayor of Amarillo. He's been good enough to join us. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here. Your thoughts on this very difficult afternoon?
Well, thank you, Shepard. Of course, our prayers go out to Evelyn and her 2 children and the rest of the Husband family. My youngest daughter and I were down for the launch on January 16th at the invitation of Commander Husband. And we were just so proud of Amarillo's own as he and the other astronauts went into space. And today, of course, there's a considerable amount of mourning going on in this city just because of the closeness of their family to so many families in our community. I was thankful to know him. He was a great man, and we're going to sorely miss him. We were proud of him in this city, as we were of all the astronauts who went into space. And I was thankful to know him personally, too, as he's a very godly man. He gave glory to the Lord right before he went into space, and we shared the stage on 2 or 3 occasions, one at the Franklin Graham Crusade here in Amarillo a few years ago, and he shared his testimony, and just I was thankful to know him in that way, too, especially now at the end of his life.
Commander Husband, Mr. Mayor, his 2nd space flight, and he's quoted as saying prior to liftoff, "It's been pretty much a lifelong dream and just a thrill to be able to get to actually live it out." This in an interview before launch. 2nd space flight, selected in 1994 on his 4th try. And my understanding of that day, from what I've been able to read in this quick period of time, is that it was one of the most exciting and happiest of his life.
Yes, this was his dream. And there's no greater way to live your life, living a dream, or for your life to end doing that what you enjoy the most. And I know, next to being with his family and enjoying that time with them, this was his passion. This was what he loved, to do things for our country and for our world. And the mission that he was on was important to the United States and to the world. And to be able to live a dream and to live it in the way that he did, with the attitude and the joy that he lived it. It's a tribute not only to Commander Husband and the astronauts of that flight, but it's also a tribute to our American way of life.
Indeed, I know that he not only both on a religious aspects of life and on secular aspects of life in your town, it's my understanding that he was a great participator within the community.
He was. He honored the Lord in all that he did, and for that I'm thankful. And it's encouraging to see men and women of that kind of character who go forth and live their dreams. And I think it's an inspiration to especially our younger people in this nation to see that you can do the right things and that you can go forth and make a difference in this world. And that's what Commander Husband did. He made a difference in this world. I had the privilege of speaking with his wife 3 or 4 times this last week.